The prosecutor husband returned from a business trip, bringing gifts for everyone in the family. A silk scarf for his mother, a watch for his sister, even the nanny got a box of pastries. Yet there was nothing for me. Is that all? Hugo looked at me coldly. You want a divorce over such a trivial matter? As I helped him undress, folding the suit jacket still warm from his body, I said calmly, it's not just about this. For years of marriage, 3 years he chose to be posted overseas, claiming my low education made me unworthy of him. An unexpected pregnancy led to a hasty marriage. When I lost the child, he blamed me for not being careful enough. I gave up my dream of becoming a manga artist to be a full-time housewife, and he said I lacked insight and only knew how to spend money. I gripped the sleeve of his suit jacket tightly. The wool fabric beneath my fingertips felt delicate and smooth, carrying his usual scent of cool wood, along with a hint of dust from the journey back. His 3-year assignment abroad had finally come to an end, and he was back. My heart beat heavily in my chest as I gathered every ounce of courage I had. It's not just about that. Hugo lowered his gaze, his eyes resting on my hand that was clutching his sleeve, completely devoid of emotion. He had just showered and changed into a dark gray silk loungewear, his posture elegant and upright. An intangible sense of distance pushed me 1,000 miles away. We stood there in that enormous study, just a step apart yet feeling as though separated by countless mountains. He finally spoke, his voice clear and cold. Sylvia, this marriage contract was arranged by our 2 families long ago. 4 years ago, it was you who approached me, saying you were willing to marry. Hearing these words, my body involuntarily froze. Yes, I took the initiative. At my most wretched moment, I clung to him as if grasping at the last lifeline. I instinctively rubbed the fabric, my fingertips tingling with a familiar sting. It was the callus left from years of holding a pen, but also the scars from needle pricks that had healed, scars from when I had painstakingly hand-stitched this suit to surprise him. He didn't know. He knew nothing about these past 4 years. Perhaps it was my overly pale face that moved him for a moment. Hugo let out an almost imperceptible sigh. I was in a rush for this business trip. Forgetting to bring you a gift was my oversight. There was an added tone in his voice, something resembling reassurance. I'll have Lincoln order the latest designer bag for you tomorrow. Tell him directly which brand you prefer. My heart sank abruptly. So, in his eyes, all my unusual behavior tonight was simply because I hadn't received a gift after his business trip. My throat burned painfully. I wanted to explain, to tell him that I wasn't waiting for a gift, that I had never cared about these things. But when I opened my mouth, not a single sound came out. For years of silent marriage had long since worn away my ability to speak. Hugo's brow furrowed slightly, showing a hint of impatience. That subtle irritation, unintentionally revealed by someone in a position of power, could easily crush me. It's getting late. You should rest early. I stood frozen in place until the study door was gently closed by Hugo. That soft click sounded like a lock, shutting all my emotions out the door. Returning to the master bedroom, the king-sized bed felt starkly divided. I lay at the edge of the bed, my body tense. The air was thick with suppressed silence, broken only by our shallow breaths. Suddenly, the mattress beside me sank. Hugo turned over, moving closer to me. The familiar scent of pine instantly enveloped me, carrying a hint of aggressiveness as it wormed its way into my nostrils. My body reacted faster than my mind, tensing up abruptly. The words my mother-in-law spoke with underlying meaning during the day exploded in my ears. Sylvia, it's time for you two to have a child. A sharp, throbbing pain suddenly shot through the depths of my lower abdomen. Cold sweat immediately soaked through my back. Instinctively, I curled up my body, digging my nails deep into my palms. An arm stretched out and came to a halt above me. I closed my eyes, awaiting the routine event that had been as regular as clockwork for the past 4 years. Yet, the expected weight did not descend. With just a soft click, the last bit of light at the bedside flickered out. He withdrew his hand, turned away, and once again widened the distance between us. The suffocating scent of pine gradually faded away. Tense muscles finally relaxed, and the sharp pain eased along with them. In the darkness, I let out a long sigh of relief, grateful. Yet, immediately following that was an even more overwhelming sense of loss. I silently mocked myself in the darkness. Sylvia, what on earth were you expecting? Hugo, the favored son of heaven. At the age of 26, he passed the judicial examination with the second highest score in the country, with a promising future ahead of him. Throughout City A, the list of socialites and young ladies wanting to marry him could stretch from the east end of the city to the west. Yet in the end, he married me. An ordinary girl with nothing to her name but painting. I still remember that rainy day 4 years ago. I held the thin test report that read 6 weeks pregnant, like a gambler, standing before the grand gate of Hugo's house. After hearing me out, Hugo fell silent for a full 3 days. 3 days later, this man who had always been so proud finally bowed his head to trouble like me. He didn't like me. I had known it from the very first day of our marriage. For these 4 years I'd been treading on thin ice, trying my best to play the role of a perfect wife, hoping to make up for everything I forced upon him. But it was all in vain. I owe him an apology. I've always owed him. 7 o'clock in the morning, the first light of dawn barely breaking. Hugo returned from his morning run, covered in a light sheen of sweat and carrying the crisp, fresh air of early spring. I retrieved a clean towel from the hallway cabinet and handed it over. It's chilly outside. Go inside and take a hot shower. My voice was calm. He took the towel, his movements pausing briefly as he wiped his forehead. Those deep eyes fell upon me, sweeping over me inch by inch. I'm wearing an old, faded sweatshirt from my university art studio days, with the school emblem on the chest, its printed logo already peeling and cracked. His eyes turned cold, his thin lips pressed into a straight line. I won't be back for dinner tonight, I have a business engagement. He threw the towel aside and walked toward the bathroom without another word. I had long grown accustomed to it. Bending down, I picked up the towel that still carried his body warmth, ready to take it to wash. Housekeeper Clara came out of the kitchen carrying breakfast. Seeing the faint blue shadows under my eyes, she lowered her voice sympathetically. Madam, did you stay up late painting again? Sir is back, you should get more rest. I turned around and gestured for her to be quiet. Clara immediately understood and fell silent. In the few steps toward the study, a thought flashed through my mind. My footsteps suddenly halted on the spot. I finally understood what Hugo's icy gaze just now had truly meant. He thought I had deliberately dressed like this to silently protest the gift that didn't arrive yesterday. That I was using this way to demonstrate to him, expressing my dissatisfaction. A wave of bitterness surged from the depths of my heart. So, in his eyes, I am such a petty and scheming person. What's even more tragic is that I actually know him so well. I closed my eyes, forcing down that feeling of bitterness, and pushed open the study door. This was the only place in this home that could offer me a moment of peace. I sat down and opened the household ledger. Grocery lists, water and electricity bills, gas fees, social expenses, row after row of numbers and entries clearly listed every expenditure this household had incurred over the past 4 years. My fingers gripped the pen, the tips pressing against the cool surface of the paper. In each stroke, my chaotic thoughts slowly settled. Only here, while handling these trivial yet tangible tasks, I was simply myself. Just as I finished checking the final bill and was about to close the ledger, the internal phone rang. It was the voice of Uncle Charles, the butler, as steady as ever. Madam, Mr. Lincoln is here. Lincoln? Hugo's chief assistant. My fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. Uncle Charles's voice continued. He said Hugo asked him to deliver something to you. I put down the receiver and sat quietly for a moment. Lincoln. This name was like a pebble, stirring ripples in the lake of my heart that had just settled. I stood up and walked out of the study. In the living room, the atmosphere felt somewhat tense. Lincoln stood at the entrance in a well-tailored dark suit, his demeanor as professional and restrained as ever. In his hand was a large shopping bag bearing a logo I couldn't name, yet its unmistakably high-end appearance made its price tag evident. Clara and a few other aunties stood nearby, keeping their eyes lowered yet couldn't resist peeking from the corners of their eyes. In their gazes, there was sympathy, curiosity, and a hint of understanding. I calmly walked over. "Lincoln, thank you for your hard work." Lincoln gave a slight nod and handed over the shopping bag, his voice calm and steady. "This is on Hugo's orders." He said it's compensation for the mistress. Compensation. A knot formed in my chest, leaving me unable to breathe properly. I didn't reach out to take it. "Clara, just accept it." Clara quickly stepped forward, taking the heavy bag from Lincoln's hands. The moment her fingers touched the bag, I noticed her shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, take care, Lincoln." I gave the dismissal. Lincoln didn't seem inclined to linger either. After politely saying his farewells, he turned and left swiftly. The door closed, cutting off the outside gaze. Clara held that bag, unable to hide the anger on her face. "Madam, this." I raised my hand, stopping her from finishing her sentence. "Put it at the very back of the closet in the dressing room, don't let me see it." I whispered my instructions. After everyone had dispersed, only the butler, Uncle Charles, remained. He closed the study door, and the respectful demeanor of a butler faded from his face, replaced by a gentle, almost paternal warmth. "Madam." He handed me a document. "What is this?" I asked. "A publishing house is interested in your online serialized comic Childhood Times and wants to sign a publishing contract with you." My hand froze in midair. A few seconds later, I let out a soft, almost self-mocking laugh. So, there are still people willing to listen to my unspoken feelings. Also, Uncle Charles's voice paused as if he were choosing his words. I asked a friend from our hometown to inquire. "There's hope that your younger brother, M.O., could be transferred back within 6 months. M.O. coming back." Those words exploded in my mind like a clap of thunder. 4 years. For him, I married into the Hugo family, gave up my ideals, and trapped myself in this luxurious cage. I thought for the rest of our lives, my brother and I would only be able to watch each other from afar. Now, Uncle Charles tells me he can return. An immense, indescribable mix of elation and sorrow surged through me, leaving my entire body tingling. In my mind, Uncle Charles's words, transferred back within 6 months, were still buzzing, leaving me utterly unsettled. Those memories, which I had firmly suppressed in my heart for 4 years, burst forth like a floodgate opening, instantly shattering the carefully constructed dam. It felt as though I saw my father again. He didn't have a high level of education, but he was the most optimistic person I had ever known, always saying that people should live like sunflowers, forever facing the sun. With his woodworking skills, he raised my younger brother and me all by himself, and his rough hands could carve the most exquisite wooden combs. In my memory, he once carried a blood-soaked man out of a car accident. That man was Hugo's father. Because of this, the two families formed a slight acquaintance, but it later became my only lifeline. The scene shifts. It was my father lying on the white hospital bed, never to wake up again. An unexpected construction site collapse took him away, along with the only light left in our family. The sky had fallen. My younger brother, working at a factory in another city, had his fingers mangled by a machine and nearly became disabled. Grandma's health was deteriorating day by day, and medical expenses loomed like a mountain. Clutching my thin university diploma, I struggled at every turn in the city. The paintings I once took pride in were now worthless in the face of survival. Despair swirled like a dark vortex, pulling me little by little toward the abyss. Until the day I found a business card tucked inside my father's old wallet, printed with Hugo's home address. I dialed that number. Using the little bit of weak affection my father left behind from sacrificing his life to save others, using the most precious years of a girl's 20s, to exchange for a chance for my grandmother to survive. This is a debt. One that the Hugo family owes my father. Tears finally broke free from my eyes, drop by drop falling on the dark redwood desktop. I bit my lips hard, not letting a single sound escape, though my throat was filled with muffled, trapped animal-like sobs. "Mrs. Lynn," Uncle Charles's voice gently sounded, tinged with a trace of reluctance. "Actually, over the years, Hugo has always asked me to have someone keep an eye on Mr. Mo's work." I suddenly looked up, tears blurring my vision as I stared at him. "He asked you to keep an eye on me?" "Yes." Uncle Charles handed over a tissue, lowering his voice even further. "The master isn't good with words, but he's always kept your family matters in mind. This opportunity for the transfer was only possible because he pulled several strings." My heart felt as if it had been tightly gripped by a hand, then slowly eased open. A bittersweet mix of sourness, resentment, and an indescribable hint of sweetness. So, what I had to fight so hard to beg for, he had quietly been doing it all along. I took the tissue, wiped my face roughly, my voice hoarse. "Thank you, Uncle Charles." Uncle Charles sighed, looking at me with gentle eyes. "Madam, you are a good young lady. From now on, build a good life with your husband, support him and raise your children well, and you will find yourself on an increasingly smooth path." I lowered my head, gazing at the mess of coffee stains on the table, a faint smile curling at the corner of my lips. A smooth path? Maybe so. But my life shouldn't have just that one road. I had just finished tidying up the desk when the nanny from Eleanor's side came to fetch me, saying she had prepared a tonic. In Eleanor's room, a strong aroma of medicinal herbs filled the air. After studying me for a moment, she pushed a pitch-black bowl of soup toward me. "You haven't looked well these past few days, so I had the kitchen prepare something. Drink it while it's hot to help nourish your body." I take it, nodding obediently. "Thank you, Mom." She elegantly adjusts the jade bracelet on her wrist, her voice neither too loud nor too soft. At Hugo's age, his friends' kids can already help run errands. Vincent's son, in a video call the other day, had already learned to say daddy. My fingers holding the spoon tightened slightly, the tips turning white. "Indeed." Eleanor sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window, as if speaking to herself or perhaps to me. If that incident hadn't happened back then, and Hugo had married Chloe, I might have grandchildren by now. Chloe. This name is like a tiny needle, always popping up unexpectedly to prick me. I lowered my gaze and silently drank that bowl of bitter, astringent soup, feeling as if a ball of cotton were stuck in my throat. In this household, it seems I will always be an intruder, an accident that has taken someone else's place. Returning to the master bedroom, I finally felt like I had come back to life. I drew open the curtains, letting the evening sunlight pour in unreservedly, falling onto my painting desk. Only here can I briefly catch my breath. I spread out the drawing paper, but my brush hesitates to touch it. Marrying Hugo was seen as an immense stroke of luck to outsiders. The family upholds proper values and treats me with courtesy, so I should be content. Yet the warmth and chill of marriage are known only to oneself. I suddenly recall the early days of our marriage, when there was no painting desk in this bedroom. Hugo's study is spacious, with excellent natural lighting, and one entire wall is lined with books. I once cautiously asked him if he could spare a small corner in the study for my easel and paints. He was looking down at the documents, but upon hearing that, he raised his head. That was the first time I saw such a cold expression on his face. It was like a calm lake surface instantly freezing over. He looked at me, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The study is a place for work. Don't bring your things there." My things. My paintings, my pens, over 20 years of my life and dreams, in his eyes, they were just those things. From that day on, I never mentioned the word study again. I moved all my painting supplies into this master bedroom, carving out a small, pitiful territory for myself within this space that belonged to both of us. The light of the setting sun gradually turned dim and yellow. I picked up the brush, dipped it in ink, and was about to begin. The voice of the housekeeper Clara came from downstairs, cutting clearly through this tranquility. "Ma'am, sir is back." The ink on the pen's tip spread across the rice paper, forming an unsightly blot. the door opened. The warm, moist air mingled with the refreshing scent of lemongrass from the shower gel, wafting into my face. Hugo was wearing a dark gray set of loungewear, his short hair still dripping with water. Droplets rolled down his sharp jawline, disappearing into his collar. He walked straight toward me. Instinctively, I tensed my back and curled the fingers holding my paintbrush. His shadow enveloped both me and the painting on my desk. A hand landed on my shoulder, the fabric of my thin clothing barely muffling the searing heat of his palm. My entire body stiffened. "When did you learn to paint?" His voice, laced with the languor of someone just out of a shower, fell beside my ear. Yet his gaze remained fixed on my unfinished painting. It was an early autumn mountain scene. I had used generous amounts of ochre and gamboge, trying to capture the feeling of the forest bathed in the setting sun. The colors are well chosen. It was as if he had discovered something novel, his tone carrying a hint of surprise. "In these years of marriage, you've put in quite a lot of effort." A surge of bitterness welled up in my heart, leaving me feeling somewhat low. Quite a lot of effort indeed. In his eyes, my little knack for painting is merely a pastime to kill time after marriage. Just like my mother-in-law Eleanor's flower arrangement and tea ceremony. I didn't explain. Over these 4 years, I've grown accustomed to it. I simply tugged at the corner of my mouth, revealing a faint smile, then lowered my head, pretending to continue packing up my painting supplies. The hand resting on my shoulder, however, didn't move away. Hugo's gaze shifted from the sketchpad, sweeping over the cramped little space I had been forced to squeeze into the corner of the bedroom. An easel, paints, and stacks of neatly arranged rice paper. Cramped and crowded, just like those dreams of mine with nowhere to go, utterly disheveled. He seemed to recall something, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. "Why don't you?" His words broke off abruptly in mid-sentence. I didn't even need to look up to imagine the expression on his face at that moment. Probably regret, perhaps mixed with a hint of awkwardness. He wanted to ask why I wasn't painting in the study. He thought again of that study, a place I was strictly forbidden to enter. There was no such painting table in this bedroom then. I had asked him, full of anticipation and caution, whether he could spare a little corner for me by the window in the study. I didn't need much space, just enough to set up my easel. He was leaning against the headboard reading a document. Hearing this, he lifted his eyelids to look at me. That was the first time I had seen such nearly harsh indifference on his face. He looked at me, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The study is a place for work. Don't bring your things in there." The air grew still. The hand resting on my shoulder felt like a branding iron, its heat searing into my flesh and making the muscles beneath my skin contract. That unfinished sentence hung between us, a wave of awkwardness spreading. After a long moment, Hugo withdrew his hand. He turned around, took 2 steps in front of my small painting desk, then came to a stop. "Sorry." His voice was very low, as if painfully squeezed out from his chest. Back then, I was prejudiced. I held the paintbrush, my fingertips icy cold. Prejudice. How light a word. Yet I clearly remember that on our wedding night, he used your things to describe my painting supplies, which I treasured like jewels. The humiliation of being dismissed along with my dreams was like a thorn in my heart, pricking me for 4 years. Now, that thorn has been smoothed by my own hands, fused into my flesh and blood. Hearing him apologize again didn't stir the emotions I had imagined. I didn't even feel a hint of grievance. I just found it somewhat ridiculous. "It's too late. I had Uncle Charles tidy up the study and move all your painting supplies inside." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a patronizing sincerity. "The lighting is good, and there's plenty of space." I lifted my gaze and quietly watched him. The coldness that had once been on his face was gone. "I'm doing just fine here," I said softly, my voice as calm as if I were discussing the weather. "I feel more at ease." Hugo's brow furrowed, seemingly taken aback by my refusal. "Do you have enough paint and canvas? If not, I'll ask Lincoln to buy more, the finest quality." Once again, he attempted to compensate with material things. This was what he excelled at, the only way he knew how. Now is just fine, I responded perfunctorily. He fell silent for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Sylvia, from now on, just call me by my name. Those words again. And those designer bags are just material things, you don't need to take them to heart. He looked at me, his tone carrying an instructive persuasion. Like a magnanimous teacher guiding his dull-witted student. I suddenly felt a strong urge to laugh. So in his heart, I was still that shallow woman who would dwell on a bag or a study. I suppressed my smile and obediently nodded. I understand. I'm used to it. During these 4 years of marriage, I've long grown accustomed to this unequal form of communication. His gaze returned to the comic draft on my desk, landing on the page titled Snowy Night. It's painted very well. He sincerely praised it, then said in a tone that took it for granted. Once it's finished, I'll keep the original for my collection. I didn't say anything. He didn't ask further, just glanced at his wristwatch. It's late, time for bed. He was the first to turn and walk towards the large bed. The ceiling light in the bedroom had been turned off at some point, leaving only a dim, warm bedside lamp. The air was filled with the familiar scent of cedar incense he often used. Ambiguous, yet suffocating. Hugo's presence closed in, carrying the cold scent of cedar, his hands just as scorching. My body tensed into a straight line. A soft touch met my lips, yet I felt no warmth. My consciousness detached itself and drifted back to the wedding night 4 years ago. An unfamiliar room, an unfamiliar him. No kisses, no foreplay, only a tearing pain and an icy command. Bear with it. Afterwards, he went straight to the bathroom, leaving me alone, like a dying fish thrown ashore, silently curling up on the massive bed. Now, his movements are much gentler. Even with a hint of clumsy probing. Yet for me, it makes no difference. Just like exchanging a blunt knife for a slightly sharper one, the pain of the cut, in essence, remains the same. In the midst of utter chaos, I heard him speak by my ear. Sylvia, we should have a child. It wasn't a discussion, it was a declaration. I lay with my eyes open, gazing at the dim light and shadows on the ceiling, without responding. Counting tonight, it's been 4 years, 3 times. So this was the whole reason for his unusual behavior tonight. At 6 in the morning, my biological clock woke me up right on time. I opened my eyes to the dim morning light. Hugo was still fast asleep beside me. His arm lay heavily across my waist, like an inescapable shackle. I shifted slightly, a familiar soreness spreading through my body, yet the sharp, piercing pain that had plagued me for the past 4 years was gone. For a moment, I froze. So even my body had learned to grow numb. I held my breath, carefully moving his arm off me inch by inch, then soundlessly slipped out of bed. The moment my feet touched the ground, my legs went weak. I steadied myself by holding on to the edge of the bed, took a moment to compose myself, and then headed toward the walk-in closet. When I came out after changing, Clara, the housekeeper, was already waiting by the door. She saw me, a fleeting flash of heartache in her eyes, then lowered her voice. Madam, you're up so early. Breakfast is ready. I nodded and headed straight to my mother-in-law Eleanor's room. It was the rule, every day, the menu and schedule had to be reported to her first. Eleanor was tending to her precious orchids on the balcony. Hearing my voice, she didn't even turn her head. Have you finished preparing the guest list for this year's spring feast? Hurry up, don't make it look as mismatched as it did the first year, so we don't become a laughingstock. Her tone was flat, yet cutting. I lowered my gaze and replied, yes. Eleanor finally turned around, her gaze sweeping over me before settling back on her flowers, as if talking to herself, yet also addressing me. In the blink of an eye, 4 years have passed. My heart tightened sharply. I lifted my head and looked at her. There was only a faint trace of melancholy at the passage of time on her face, before she frowned again. Ah, right, the tea party with the neighbor's wife. She forgot. She had completely forgotten that promise she made to me 4 years ago. The promise I upheld with 4 years of my youth and all of my dignity. A chilling sensation shot straight from the soles of my feet to the top of my head. Fine. Leaving Eleanor's room, a chill clung to me all day, deep in my bones. It wasn't until 8 p.m. that Hugo finally emerged from the study. I had just tidied up the living room and was about to head back to my room. He called out to me, having already made his way to the balcony. "Come here for a moment." I walked over and saw him holding my sketchbook, flipping through it page by page. It was the only corner where I could catch my breath during those 4 years. The flowers and plants on the balcony, the changing seasons outside the window, the sleeping profile of the nanny, Clara. My world was only this big. "You did well." He closed the notebook and handed it back to me, his tone unusually gentle. I took it, my fingertips brushing against his cool skin, and instinctively pulled back. He didn't seem to notice, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights as he continued. "It's a good drawing, but..." He paused, as if weighing his words. "The content is somewhat limited. Sylvia, you could try drawing something broader, like cityscapes, or the various facets of human life." My heart sank. Broader things? I lower my eyes, gazing at that small, confined world on my sketchbook. Isn't my city, my bustling life, right here in this villa? I didn't answer, and I couldn't answer. He didn't seem to expect an answer either, changing the subject instead. "Vincent will be dropping by later. Please prepare some coffee." Vincent is his closest college roommate, and also the one who looks down on me the most. I nodded and turned to head into the kitchen. The aroma of coffee beans filled the small space, yet I felt a sense of suffocation. Holding the tray, I walked to the door of the study. It was slightly ajar, and inside, I could hear Vincent's exaggerated complaints. "Hugo, you really... I heard Chloe got divorced some time ago and hasn't been doing well. If you had..." My steps froze in place. The edge of the tray I was holding dug painfully into my palm. Inside, there was silence for a few seconds, followed by Hugo's calm voice. "Marriage is a responsibility. Responsibility. Not emotions, not love, just two cold words." Vincent sneered, his tone filled with undisguised contempt. "Responsibility? What can she offer you? An ordinary art student, does she bring even a fraction of benefit to your career? Look at Chloe's father." My breath hitched, and I almost couldn't stand steady. I wanted to turn and leave, but my feet felt as if they were weighted down. I wanted to know what I truly meant in Hugo's heart. Then, I heard his voice, clear, calm, like a judge reading out a verdict that held no personal relevance. "Her background is ordinary, but she does have a talent for painting." My heart quivered abruptly at this sudden affirmation. Perhaps? But his following words, like a hammer, shattered the faint glimmer of hope that had just begun to rise within me. "It's just that, she has a slight flaw in her character. After all, women are always a bit fond of vanity. Women are always somewhat vain and superficial." Hugo's voice was indifferent. I held the tray, the cup of coffee I had carefully prepared for him now felt as heavy as 1,000 pounds. My knuckles turned white from the force. I didn't storm in to question him, nor did I lose my composure and smash the cup. I simply stumbled as I turned around. Only after returning to the master bedroom and closing the door did I set the tray down on the table. The steam from the coffee curled up, blurring my vision. I looked at the face in the mirror, pale and utterly devoid of color. It was terrifyingly unfamiliar. A lump of air clogged my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I clutched my chest, gasping for air, but all I inhaled was nothing but icy coldness. 4 years. 4 years of my youth, all traded for the words, character flaws and materialistic desires. Tears finally fell uncontrollably, splashing onto the back of my hand. My life, the perseverance I've been proud of, the dignity I've carefully maintained, have all become a complete joke at this moment. "Madam, what's wrong?" The nanny Clara pushed the door open and, upon seeing my state, was so shocked that the towel in her hand fell to the floor. She hurried over and gently touched my face. "Oh my God, why is it so cold?" I grabbed her hand, my body trembling uncontrollably. It was at this moment that I suddenly became clear-headed. I can't go on like this. If I stay any longer, I'll die here. Tears abruptly stopped. I lifted my head and looked at Clara, my voice hoarse but exceptionally calm. "Clara, help me get the file folder at the very bottom of the bedside table." Clara was stunned for a moment, but still did as told. A brown paper document envelope, somewhat worn. I take it out and place it on the dressing table, smoothing out the creases one by one. "This is something I prepared a year ago. I once naively thought that I would never have a day to use it." I have no idea how much time passed before the door handle turned and Hugo walked in. He took off his suit jacket and, noticing I was still sitting there, slightly furrowed his brow. "Why aren't you asleep yet?" His tone, as usual, carried a sense of distance. I did not respond, but simply stood up and pushed that document envelope toward him. Hugo's gaze fell on the envelope, then shifted to my face, carrying a hint of inquiry. He unsealed it and pulled out the few pages inside. When he clearly saw the words "divorce agreement," a crack finally appeared on his normally composed face. He suddenly looked up at me, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Sylvia, what are you making a fuss about?" I met his gaze. Those deep eyes I had once been infatuated with now only held a chilling coldness. I smiled, very softly, very lightly. Then, word by word, I told him clearly. "Let's get a divorce." My voice was soft, yet like a stone thrown into the still lake, it stirred up a storm in his eyes. "What's all this about?" Hugo's voice was as cold as ice. Having been in a high position for so long, his commanding presence instantly filled the entire room. In the past, such imposing pressure would likely have left me breathless. But now, I simply pulled the document calmly from his hand, turned to the last page, and pointed to the name I had already signed. The handwriting was neat, the small, regular script I had practiced for over 20 years. "Sylvia. Look, I've already signed it." I even offered him a slight smile. "Just moments ago." Hugo's gaze was fixed on that name as if trying to burn a hole through it. He lifted his eyes, his deep gaze swirling with emotions I couldn't understand: shock, rage. "When did you prepare this?" His voice was low, each word seemingly forced out from between clenched teeth. I met his gaze calmly. "A year ago." Hugo's pupils contracted sharply. The air seemed to freeze. I lowered my gaze, my voice completely even. "4 years ago, my father was seriously ill, Mo got into trouble, and I had nowhere to turn. It was me who took the initiative to ask for your help. I know it was me who got between you and Chloe, making it impossible for you two to be together. You've never been happy about it. This agreement is something I should have given you a long time ago." I thought those words would make him see me as considerate, as someone who understood his feelings. But Hugo reacted as if he had just heard the biggest joke in the world. "An explanation?" He took a step closer, his towering figure casting a shadow that completely enveloped me. "Sylvia, have you forgotten? This marriage was something I personally agreed to. I, Hugo, will take responsibility for what I've done. Why do you think I need any explanation from you?" He didn't understand. He would never understand. Over the past 4 years, I have been like a prisoner burdened with original sin, carefully trying to repay this favor with my obedience and thoughtfulness. Every late-night return, every demeaning remark about my paintings, every time he laughed and chatted with friends while leaving me aside. Those tiny, densely packed thorns have long pierced my heart, leaving it riddled with holes. I thought it was because I wasn't good enough. Only today did I understand, it wasn't that. It was me, I was simply not worthy. A fire seemed to ignite in my chest, burning me with agony. For years of pent-up grievances, in this moment, shattered all my pretenses. Tears suddenly welled up without warning, instantly blurring my vision. "Hugo." I choked back a sob, calling him by his full name for the first time, my voice trembling. I'm so tired. So tired. Hugo clearly hadn't expected me to break down so suddenly. He reached out as if to touch me, but his hand froze in midair. The anger and sharpness faded from his face, replaced by a rare hint of helplessness and annoyance. What are you tired of? He frowned, as if finally finding the crux of the issue. Is it because there's too much going on at home? I'll ask Uncle Charles to hire 2 more maids tomorrow. My heart sank abruptly. I looked at him in despair, slowly shaking my head. His annoyance grew even more evident, as if he had completely lost his patience. Then what is it for? Just because I didn't bring you a gift today? He pulled out his wallet from his pocket, took out a black card, and handed it to me. Take this card. It has no limit, buy whatever you like. Consider it my way of compensating you. Compensation. So in his eyes, all my grievances, exhaustion, and despair were nothing more than gifts, things that could be smoothed over with a bank card. The tears stopped instantly. When the heart dies, it no longer feels pain. I looked at him, my gaze as calm as still water. Hugo, what lies between us is not something that can be solved with money. If you're worried it might affect your career, I can wait for you. We can announce it whenever you feel comfortable. If you still don't agree. I took a deep breath and uttered the words I'd rehearsed countless times in my heart. I'll leave with nothing. Hugo's hand holding the black card froze in midair. He stared at me intently, for a very long time. That gaze seemed to pierce through my skin and flesh, peering into the very soul of my bones. In the end, he said nothing. He just threw the black card onto the ground, turned around, and yanked the door open with force. Bang! The enormous slamming of the door seemed to shake the entire villa. The heavy stone that had weighed on my heart for 4 years shattered in an instant. I let out a long, silent breath, an unprecedented sense of relief washing over my entire body. Before the front door had fully closed, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, emerged at the sound. She wore an exquisite silk nightgown, her face etched with its usual grace and critical air. Her gaze swept over me and landed on the glaring black card at my feet, her brows immediately knitting together. What kind of mischief are you up to so early in the morning? You've really gotten on Hugo's nerves. I bent down, picked up the signed agreement, and calmly handed it to her. Mom, we're getting a divorce. Eleanor was stunned for half a second, then let out a mocking laugh, as if she had just heard the most absurd thing imaginable. Divorce? Sylvia, have you lost your mind? What are you going to live on without our family? I looked at her, not a ripple of emotion in my eyes. Mother, I am thinking of Hugo's best interests. Now that he holds a high position and has a limitless future ahead, he truly needs a wife with a better education and a more prestigious family background to support his career. I paused, my tone sincere. A daughter-in-law who married above her station like me would only be a burden to him and cause you embarrassment among the ladies. Leaving would be the best for everyone. Eleanor was left speechless by my words. She had always valued social status and face the most, and my words struck right at what she cared about most, leaving her unable to find a single word of rebuttal. A cold figure, having left and returned unnoticed, stood at the entrance of the living room. Hugo's expression was darker than before, his gaze like a blade hardened by ice, aimed straight at me. Mom, go back to your room first. His voice carried an indisputable command. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but in the end, she dared not say more, turning away resentfully. The vast living room was left with only the two of us. Hugo walked over step by step and sat down on the sofa opposite me, bringing an overwhelming sense of pressure. He stared at me, as if interrogating a prisoner. After leaving me, how do you plan to live? He still maintained that condescending attitude, certain that I couldn't survive without him. I laughed. Hugo, I don't need any compensation from you. I have my own comic studio, which has been running for a year now, and the income is very stable. Looking at his face that instantly stiffened, I continued on. My work is contracted with a very famous editor in the industry, and the royalty is enough for me to live a very comfortable life. the air fell into a deathly silence. I could clearly see Hugo's hand resting on his knee, his knuckles tightening inch by inch until they clenched into a fist, veins bulging on the back of his hand. His prideful sense of control crumbled to dust in that moment. I withdrew my gaze, adding a touch of softness to my voice. Besides, Grandma is getting old, I want to return to my hometown and stay with her. Upon mentioning family, Hugo's tense jawline seemed to soften for an instant, a barely noticeable flash of regret flickering in his eyes. Grandma's health. I should have brought her here sooner. His voice was a bit hoarse, tinged with a hint of belated self-reproach. I shook my head. There's no need. Grandma is used to living in the countryside, she doesn't like the noise of the city. After saying this, I quietly watched him, looking at the shock, disbelief, and confusion in his eyes. After a long while, he finally found his voice, each word seemingly ground out from the depths of his throat. You planned this for a long time, didn't you? Faced with his icy, sharp questioning, I didn't even lift my eyelids. Yes. A single word, light as a feather, yet it struck Hugo's heart like a heavy hammer. I saw his pupils constrict sharply. I couldn't be bothered to entangle myself with him any longer and walked straight toward the coffee table in the living room. The handover won't take much time. I spread out several folders that I had prepared long ago, my voice steady without a hint of fluctuation. These are the warranty cards and instruction manuals for all the appliances in the villa, sorted by brand and purchase date. Here are the contact details and work schedules for the gardener, pool maintenance staff, and family doctor. This is the dry cleaner membership card for all your suits, along with prepaid cards for the restaurants you frequent. Every single item was neatly organized, clear and comprehensible at a glance. Over these 4 years, I haven't just been a canary idling away time in the art studio. Hugo stared intently at those documents, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he spoke with difficulty. All these years, you've had it tough. An expression of concern that arrived 4 years too late. Unfortunately, I no longer need it. Ignoring it, I pulled out 3 more ledgers from my bag. Now, let's go over the finances. I opened the first book, which contained the daily household expenses. The second one recorded property management fees, utilities, and social interactions. The third book detailed the expenditures from your personal account. Each entry was meticulously recorded, with supporting receipts attached. The butler, Uncle Charles, was dumbfounded and couldn't help but whisper in admiration. "Madam, you are truly amazing." I flipped to a certain page and paused for a moment at one entry. It was from the first year of our marriage, when I lost a large sum of money to a luxury shopping agent after falling for a scam. Hugo just gave me a cold glance at the time. If you can't even handle such a trivial matter, is your brain just for decoration? From that day on, I started studying finance and investment frantically, reading every related book I could find. I pushed the account book in front of Hugo. For years, total income $13,270,000, total expenses $11,080,000, remainder $2,190,000, all in this card. You can hire a professional accountant to verify. If there's even a penny off, Enough. Hugo abruptly raised his hand, cutting off my words, the veins on the back of his hand bulging. His hand was trembling. I looked up, meeting his eyes which were suppressing anger. "What's wrong, Mr. Prosecutor? Afraid I'll embezzle your family's money? Or have you always thought that I, Sylvia, am just a vain woman who would sell everything for money?" I stood up, no longer looking at him. I walked towards Uncle Charles, who was standing aside with reddened eyes, and several servants. "Uncle Charles, thank you for taking care of me all these years. Take care of yourselves from now on." Everyone spoke up to persuade me to stay, their voices filled with genuine reluctance. I smiled and shook my head, then returned to the coffee table to pour myself a glass of warm water. I raised the glass toward Hugo, whose face had turned pale. "This water is in place of wine. Hugo, thank you for helping my brother find a job. I will remember this favor." I downed the water in one gulp, then gently placed the glass back on the table, producing a crisp sound. That sound was like a full stop. You have already signed the divorce agreement. I will have the lawyer file it with the court as soon as possible. After speaking, I picked up my bag and gave him no further chance to speak. I turned around, not giving Hugo another glance. Sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, sliced into bright patches of light by the blinds, spreading out beneath my feet like a golden carpet leading to freedom. Step by step, I walked lightly yet resolutely. Just as my hand was about to touch the doorknob, a dull thud suddenly sounded from behind. That sound was the heavy impact of a knee colliding with cold marble. I turned around in shock. A young nanny, the girl named Lana, was kneeling straight in front of me. She raised her head, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of gratitude and reluctance. "Madam." Her voice trembled with sobs, echoing through the empty living room. "Thank you. Thank you for lending money for my mother's surgery 2 years ago. If it weren't for you, my mother, she wouldn't have made it. We all know you're the best person. Please, don't leave." As she spoke, she bowed deeply, touching her head to the floor. Uncle Charles and the other servants gathered around, their eyes reddened, hesitating to speak. It turns out, the kindness I thought had long been forgotten was still remembered by someone on my behalf. A hardened corner of my heart was suddenly stung by this unexpected warmth, and my eyes instantly welled up. I hurried over and helped Lana to her feet. "Get up, it's all in the past." My voice was somewhat hoarse, but it carried a gentleness I had never known before. I wiped away her tears and glanced around at these people I had lived with day in and day out. "Take care of yourself from now on." I paused for a moment before adding one more sentence. "And also, take good care of Pudding for me. It's a picky eater and only eats imported cat food. Pudding is a stray cat I found 3 years ago, and the only warmth in this cold villa." My gaze swept over the crowd, and I saw Clara hiding in the shadow of the porch, her shoulders trembling as she bit her lip hard to keep herself from crying out loud. I gave her a helpless smile. "I can't take her away, nor can I take Pudding. Everything here ultimately doesn't belong to me." Finally, my gaze fell back on that man. Hugo was still standing there, like a sculpture stripped of its soul, with an utterly unfamiliar expression of bewilderment and shock on his face. He looked at me, at the servants weeping for me, and the storm in his eyes seemed to shatter completely in an instant, leaving only incomprehensible chaos behind. 4 years. This is the first time I feel I truly see him clearly. Not through the halo of a prosecutor, not through the identity of an heir. Just a pitiful man blinded by superiority and prejudice. I withdraw my gaze, no longer feeling any attachment. Pulling open the door, I walk out without looking back. The taxi sped along the highway. Outside the window, towering skyscrapers were gradually replaced by continuous stretches of greenery. The city's noise was left behind in the wind, and the air began to fill with the fragrance of earth and plants. I rolled down the window, letting the damp, fresh breeze caress my cheeks and dry the last traces of tears. It felt like waking up from a 4-year-long nightmare. The car stopped in front of a small house with a yard in the suburbs. From a distance, I could see a frail figure leaning against the gate of the yard, standing on tiptoe and anxiously looking around. It was Grandma. I pushed open the car door and almost stumbled as I hurried over to her. "Grandma!" That cry shattered all the grievances and endurance I had held on to for the past 4 years. Grandma opened her arms, pulling me tightly into her thin yet warm embrace, her aged hand gently stroking my hair. "It's good to have you back, it's good to have you back. Sylvia, we're home." I buried my face in Grandma's lapel, which carried the scent of sunshine, inhaling the fragrance of the gardenias blooming in the yard and listening to the distant barks of dogs. Finally, my heart settled. Life back in the little cottage was like taking a life soaked in disinfectant and laying it out under the sun to dry once more. The yard was not large, but Grandma had nurtured it into a thriving space. The old warehouse covered with ivy in the corner was transformed by me into a studio. Sunlight filters through the massive wooden lattice window, spilling onto the easel. The air is filled with the scent of fresh grass and damp earth. At last, I no longer have to huddle in the cramped storage room at Hugo's house, trying to capture the play of light through a tiny window. This afternoon, my grandmother and I are tending to the flowers and plants in the courtyard. She stops beneath the pear tree at the center of the yard, her wrinkled hand gently caressing the rough bark. "Sylvia, this tree was planted by Grandma the year you married into the Hugo family." I was taken aback. Grandma's gaze grew distant, as if looking past the tree to see the frail, determined figure who left without looking back 4 years ago. "There's a saying back in our hometown, there's a pear fairy guarding the pear tree in the courtyard." "I made a deal with the pear fairy," Grandma smiled, the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes resembling dried orange peel. "I traded my peaceful nights of sleep for my Sylvia's safety and freedom in the years to come." My nose tingled with sourness, and tears unexpectedly cascaded down. It turned out that in places I couldn't see, Grandma had been praying for me for 4 years in her most humble way. I threw myself into her arms, like a lost child finally finding home. "Grandma, I've let you down." Grandma just patted my back, saying over and over, "Silly child, as long as home is here, there's nothing to be sorry about." Dinner was simple but warm. There was a steamed perch, a plate of vibrant green stir-fried vegetables, and rice made from freshly harvested grains, steaming up the whole house with its aroma. Sitting under the warm yellow light with my grandma, she kept serving me food while chattering about planning the empty space in the yard, saying she wanted to plant more roses and Chinese roses. I looked at her, and the part of my heart that had been worn rough by 4 years of marriage was slowly being filled with warmth. Here, I am not Hugo's wife, not that decorative piece that always needs to be perfect. I am just Sylvia. The inspiration that had been confined for 4 years, like a beast breaking free from its chains, ran wild across the rice paper. My comic creations are no longer bound. In the evening, I've made it a habit to take a walk in the small park nearby. The fading glow of the sunset casts a gentle golden hue over the country path, while the air is filled with the chirping of birds returning home and the fragrance of unknown flowers. I feel completely relaxed, with a lightness that comes from the very depths of my heart. But as I strolled back to the cabin's entrance, my steps came to a sudden halt. Parked at the gate was a sleek black luxury car that seemed utterly out of place. Its smooth, flowing body lines and opulent emblem resembled a colossal steel beast coiled in the rustic countryside, starkly clashing with the surroundings. It was Hugo's car. My heart sank abruptly. Before I could react, the cabin door swung open. A familiar figure came running out cheerfully. It was Clara. "Sylvia. You're back." Her face was beaming with undisguised delight, like a little sparrow seeing its owner. Seeing her, my tense nerves eased slightly, and a smile unconsciously spread across my face. But the next second, the car door opened, and a tall figure emerged from the driver's seat. Hugo. He wore a well-tailored dark gray casual suit, his usual sharpness softened, replaced by a touch of gentleness. He looked at me, his gaze devoid of the usual scrutiny and indifference, even carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite decipher. The smile on my face instantly vanished. I straightened my back, tucked away all my emotions neatly, and gave him a slight nod. "Hugo." The voice was calm, distant, polite, as if addressing a stranger. The light in Hugo's eyes dimmed at a visibly noticeable speed. Clara glanced at me, then at him, awkwardly rubbing her hands together. "Sylvia, Grandma asked me to go inside and help boil water, so I'll head in first." After saying that, she dashed back into the house like a startled rabbit. At the courtyard gate, only Hugo and I remained. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh grass from the fields, gently rustling the stray hairs on my forehead. I turned slightly, gestured politely, and spoke in a calm tone. "Come on in." He followed me in silence, his steps hesitant as if appraising this farmhouse courtyard that felt so alien to him. Once inside, Granny was sitting in a wicker chair, sorting vegetables. Upon seeing Hugo, she merely lifted her eyelids without pausing the motion of her hands. Hugo stopped in front of her, slightly bowing, his voice carrying a trace of tension that was hard to notice. "Grandma, I'm sorry. Over the past few years, I've been negligent. I didn't manage to bring you to my home. Grandma tossed a cleaned vegetable into the bamboo basket without looking up. You're being too polite, Hugo. This old body of mine isn't used to living in tall buildings. The single word Hugo instantly drew a clear boundary. Hugo's face grew even paler. Without saying a word, I turned and brought out 2 cups of freshly brewed tea from the kitchen. The tea leaves were wild tea picked from the mountains. As soon as the boiling water poured over them, a rugged fragrance spread through the air. I pushed one of the cups toward him. Give it a try, it's just something from the mountains, nothing precious. He picked up the teacup, took a sip, and his brow seemed to ease a little. The flavor is quite good, a unique taste. He set down the teacup, his gaze settling on my face once more, studying it carefully. You look much better than you did at home. As soon as the words fell, I suddenly couldn't hold back and burst into laughter. The sound echoed through the quiet room, striking an especially abrupt note. Hugo was completely stunned, his face a picture of utter confusion. I finally managed to stop laughing, wiping the tears from the corners of my eyes as I looked at him. Hugo, you probably don't know this, but in those 4 years I spent at your house, I never once laughed so freely and happily. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he took out an exquisite gift box from the paper bag he had brought, pushing it toward me. This is for you, as the weather is getting colder. I didn't open it, merely glancing at the embossed gold logo. A silk scarf. More of the same. I pushed the gift box back, my voice cold. No need, Hugo. I've never cared about these things. Back when I was living in your house, I always wore those few old outfits, not because I couldn't afford new ones, but because... I paused, meeting his puzzled gaze directly. I don't want to wear those clothes and feel like I have to become Hugo's wife again. Hugo's face completely stiffened. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he only managed to speak with difficulty. The house, it's quite messy right now. Uncle Charles is getting old, the new nanny doesn't have a method to her work, and my mom, she misses you a lot. He tried to paint a picture of a situation that required me to go back and save the day. Everyone says the family can't manage without you. I listened quietly. Is that so? I asked softly, picking up the teacup and blowing on the floating tea leaves. But I remember, it wasn't like this when I first entered your home. It was my first time learning to host a tea party, and I accidentally broke your mother's favorite set of rewrote teacups. The guests were whispering among themselves, and your mother's expression was so dark it looked like water about to drip from her face. My voice was soft, yet it felt like an awl, chipping away at his heart, one strike at a time. Where were you then? I was alone in the kitchen, staring at the shards on the floor, completely at a loss. Uncle Charles slipped in quietly to help me clean up and comforted me for a long time. Where were you back then? From that day on, I scoured the market for every book on tea ceremony, floral arrangement, household management, and even the appraisal of rare porcelain. I wasn't born knowing how to handle wealthy ladies, nor was I born with the skills to manage a large family of dozens. I raised my eyes, my gaze like an ice-cold blade, piercing straight toward him. I didn't learn it naturally, Hugo. I endured countless silent setbacks, swallowing my shattered teeth with blood in the dead of night, forcing myself to learn it all. He suddenly turned his head away, avoiding my gaze, his jawline tightly clenched. The room was eerily silent. I slowly stood up, walked to the door, and pulled open that wooden door. The pear tree in the courtyard rustled in the evening breeze. The tea is finished. The divorce agreement is clear, we owe each other nothing. Hugo, please leave now. I thought the finality of that day would be enough to make him stay away. But it didn't. After that, every weekend afternoon, he would appear punctually at the courtyard gate. He didn't knock or speak, just quietly left some things on the stone steps by the entrance before turning and walking away. Sometimes he brought imported low-sugar pastries for Grandma, other times, it was a few of the latest law journals, with interesting cases he had marked in pencil on the title pages. Looking at those things, I felt not a trace of emotion, only a sense of irony. So it wasn't that he didn't know how to be thoughtful, it's just that this thoughtfulness had never belonged to me in the past 4 years. Until that day, what he brought was nothing else but a heavy, original hardcover album about flower and bird paintings. I was sitting in the courtyard, sketching a newly blooming hollyhock, while he quietly observed through the fence for a long time. "What are your thoughts on Emperor Huizong's hibiscus and golden pheasant painting?" He suddenly spoke, his voice gentle, like an old friend discussing academic matters. My brush paused for a moment, somewhat taken aback. "The colors are rich and vibrant, luxurious and elegant, but the technique is too rigid, lacking a bit of charm." "So, you admire Sushi's unrestrained wildness even more?" I raised my head to meet his gaze. Basking in the sunlight, he seemed to shed his usual prosecutor's stern demeanor, with a genuine curiosity evident in his eyes. Unconsciously, I engaged in a longer conversation with him, shifting from discussing Emperor Huizong's slender gold calligraphy style to Mifu's ode to shoe silk. I have to admit, aside from the mess between us, he really is a great conversationalist, knowledgeable, with unique insights. Such exchanges unexpectedly gave me a long-lost, exhilarating sense of meeting a worthy opponent. Perhaps this brief moment of harmony gave him the wrong impression. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke up, his voice tinged with a suppressed plea. "Sylvia, give me another chance. Let's go home, okay?" The word home sounded especially grating coming from his mouth. I set down my paintbrush, and that small flicker of admiration I had just begun to feel vanished in an instant. I wasn't angry, just calmly looking at him. "Come with me." I turned and pushed open the door to the storage room in the corner of the yard. A blend of turpentine and ink rushed toward my face. Inside, it was no longer the cluttered scene of farming tools piled haphazardly. Sunlight poured in from the skylight, illuminating a room filled with easels and paintings. The walls, the floor, were covered with my works. There were roaring waves crashing against the shore, ancient roads with westerly winds, and the glowing lights of thousands of homes in the city. Hugo stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes filled with shock. "Hugo," I turned around, my voice clear and calm. "This is the reason I don't go back to that home. Your house is huge, yet there isn't a single room where I can set up my easel. The card you gave me can buy any expensive jewelry and fancy clothes, but it can't buy me a quiet afternoon to paint." His lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to explain something. I didn't give him the chance. "Do you remember our wedding night?" His body stiffened abruptly, and his face turned deathly pale in an instant. I was terrified, my voice flat, as though narrating someone else's story. I was trembling all over with fear, but you just looked at me coldly, then went to the study and closed the door. Later, you went out of town for 3 months on a case. I wanted to accompany you, I wanted a change of scenery. You said, "What would you do there? Serve me tea and water?" Those moments that once shattered my heart, now that I speak of them, I no longer feel the pain. Just numb. All of that is in the past. I don't resent you now, nor do I hate you. I walked to the window, looking at the room full of paintings. I just realized, I have a wild nature, and the kind of wealth your family has is something I can't handle. It suffocates me. I casually pointed at a painting I had just completed, depicting a rainbow after a storm. "See, my paintings no longer feature only that pear blossom. My world has already become so vast. How could I possibly retreat back to that cage of limited space, where even my breath depended on the moods of others?" Standing at the center of the studio, surrounded by my works and words, Hugo looked like a lost child. The color drained from his face, and for the first time a look of distress and helplessness appeared in his eyes, which had always been calm and composed. The confrontation in that studio seemed to have finally made him give up completely. A month passed, and Hugo never appeared again. Moss had grown again on the stone steps outside the courtyard gate. My life returned to an unprecedented state of calm. All day long, the early summer rain fell in gentle, lingering threads, washing the flowers and plants in the courtyard until they glowed with a vivid green. I no longer painted crashing waves and roaring storms. Instead, I captured the rain beating against banana leaves and sparrows seeking shelter under the eaves. The heart is at peace, and the world beneath the pen grows gentle as well. Clara came back in, holding an umbrella, and casually mentioned as she closed it. Sylvia, I heard from the driver that things at Hugo's house have been chaotic lately. The mistress fired the kitchen maid. I was mixing the mineral green paint and responded with a faint hum upon hearing this. Those people and things, for me, have already become as distant as mountains and rivers, unable to stir even the slightest ripple. But this peace, in the end, is fleeting. In the curtain of rain, a familiar black car abruptly stopped at the gate of the courtyard. The car door opened, and Hugo stepped out, holding a black umbrella. My heart sank, and just as I was about to turn back into the house, I saw him walk around to the other side and open the rear car door. A figure stumbled out of the car. That figure was very thin, swallowed up by a large, loose coat, appearing hollow. Supported by Hugo, he walked unsteadily toward the gate, his head bowed low. My heart pounded uncontrollably for no apparent reason. Through the drizzling rain, I couldn't clearly see his face, but I felt an overwhelmingly familiar presence in his figure. As they approached, the man looked up. My mind went completely blank. Time seemed to stand still, and the world faded away, leaving only that pale, haggard, and terribly emaciated face. That is my brother, M.O. M.O. My lips trembled, unable to form complete words, and tears instantly poured out like a breached dam. I charged into the rain like a madwoman, ignoring the muddy ground underfoot, and tightly embraced him in one swift motion. He was too thin. Through the thin fabric, I could almost feel each distinct rib. Sis. Mo's voice was hoarse, as if scraped by sandpaper. He hugged me back, his body trembling violently. I could feel warm liquid, drop by drop, falling onto the nape of my neck. I pulled him away from Hugo's side and led him into the house. Grandma, who was reading the newspaper in the living room, heard the commotion and looked up. The smile on her face froze the moment she saw M.O. M.O. My dear grandson. Looking at his grandmother, Mo's eyes instantly reddened. His legs went weak as he knelt straight down, kowtowing heavily. Grandma, I've let you down. The newspaper in Grandma's hand fluttered to the ground. She tried to stand up but suddenly swayed, collapsing straight backward. Grandma. M.O. and I screamed out in unison, our voices filled with anguish. The entire afternoon, the small courtyard was shrouded in chaos and sorrow. After the doctor had left, and after settling Grandma, who had fallen into a deep sleep, and the equally exhausted M.O., I finally found a moment to catch my breath. Stepping out of the room, Hugo was still standing there. He didn't enter the room, but stood under the eaves of the studio, quietly gazing at the paintings that filled the space. The sound of rain dripped steadily, making the surroundings feel exceptionally quiet. I walked up to him, composed my emotions, and then, facing him, bowed deeply and earnestly. Thank you. This bow was for my brother, who had endured so much suffering, and for our family, weathered by storms and tribulations. He turned sideways, seemingly unwilling to accept my bow, his voice tinged with suppressed anger. Sylvia, there's no need for such formality between us. I straightened up and looked at him calmly. Hugo, we're already divorced. We should keep our grudges and gratitude separate. This thank you, you deserve it. I'm helping you, not so you can settle these accounts with me. He finally couldn't hold back and stepped forward, his eyes swirling with emotions I couldn't understand. Instinctively, I retreated, putting distance between us. That move seemed to wound him deeply. He let out a self-mocking laugh, his voice filled with exhaustion and hoarseness. You think I'm just trying to make up for what I owe you? He paused for a moment, his gaze piercing through the curtain of rain as it swept toward an unknown distant place. Years ago, when my father was in a car accident, it was your father who risked his own life to pull him out. My family owes yours a massive debt. I turned and walked into the studio, pulling that bank card out from the drawer. This is all the money I got from selling my first painting. I pinched the thin card between my fingers and walked over to him again. Here, this is for you. I handed the card over. I know it's far from enough. Not enough to repay you for helping Mo get the job transfer, and not enough to cover all the expenses over the past 4 years. But this is a beginning. I will strive to earn money, bit by bit, until I've repaid everything I owe you. My voice was calm, as if stating a simple, undeniable fact. Hugo stared fixedly at the card, as if looking at some venom-tipped blade. He didn't take it. A dangerous silence hung in the air, and even the sound of the rain seemed to diminish. Suddenly, he let out a laugh, a desolate sound that carried through the air. Paid off? He jerked his head up, his eyes bloodshot. The suppressed emotions finally erupted like a volcano. Sylvia, in your mind, is everything between us nothing more than an account to be settled with money? His voice was hoarse. I helped you, not so you could settle accounts with me. I regret it, I regret that I was blind before, mistaking the pearl in my palm for an eyesore. He stepped forward, his scorching fingers gripping my wrist. The bank card slipped from between my fingers and fell onto the damp stone steps, making a faint sound. I love you. 3 words, spoken from his lips, carried the desperate heat of a last gamble. My heart clenched fiercely. His gaze was scorching, as if to burn me through. Sylvia, let's start over, okay? He softened his voice, carrying a hint of tenderness that bordered on pleading. We'll move out of the old house and buy a new one with a yard, building a south-facing glass conservatory as your studio. You can paint every day, until it gets dark. If you want to travel the world and sketch, I'll go with you. You want to see the northern lights, we'll go to Norway. You want to paint the desert, we'll go to the Sahara. We can bring the child back. The future he painted was like a vibrant oil painting, every stroke precisely hitting the softest places in my heart. It was a dream so warm it felt almost unreal. My heart began to beat uncontrollably fast, and for a moment, I was almost ready to nod in agreement. Looking over his shoulder, I saw the unfinished painting in the studio. In the painting, a bird was about to break free from layers of tangled vines, soaring toward a vast, boundless sky. That scene felt like a bucket of ice water, pouring straight over my head. All my agitation and soft-heartedness instantly cooled. I gently pulled my hand free from his. Hugo, I looked up, meeting his hopeful gaze. You described it beautifully, really beautifully. But status always comes with responsibility. The identity of Hugo's wife is a heavy chain for me. My voice was clear and resolute. I am very selfish. I don't want to learn flower arranging anymore just to please someone else. I don't want to wear uncomfortable high heels for social events anymore, and I don't want to spend all my time on endless household chores and social niceties. I want to be a free bird. His face grew paler with each word I spoke. The light in his eyes dimmed inch by inch. I looked at him and spoke the final answer, word by word. I'm not willing. Time seemed to stand still. The last glimmer of light in his eyes faded away completely. He slowly released his hand, his shoulders slumped in defeat, like a tree stripped of all vitality. He said nothing more, just gave me a deep look, then turned and walked step by step back into the curtain of rain. That upright figure now seemed utterly desolate. The black car slid away silently, disappearing at the end of the alley. I stood still, looking down at the wet bank card at my feet. After that rain, Hugo never showed up again. A month later, the last rain of late autumn fell, and my grandmother also fell ill. She was very calm, and so was I. We all know, the willpower that's keeping her going is just to wait until both Mo and I are settled. Now, that willpower has vanished. Hugo still came. He didn't bring up any topics between us, he just brought along a renowned traditional Chinese medicine doctor. After the examination, the doctor told me that Grandma has, at most, 2 months left. I softly thanked them and saw them out. Afterwards, Hugo came every day, bringing all kinds of warming and nourishing herbs, like a silent shadow. He sat under the corridor, not entering the room to disturb, only stepping forward quietly when I needed a hand. I had declined, but he just shook his head and then continued to keep silent watch. So I let him be. In November, the last autumn rain pattered softly against the window frame. Grandma, who had been sleeping deeply all along, miraculously woke up that afternoon, her spirits startlingly sharp. She even sat up on her own, draped her outer garment over her shoulders, her cloudy eyes showing a glimmer of clarity. "Hugo, come here." Grandma's voice was soft, yet clear. Hugo hurried into the room and sat down on the low stool by my bed, leaning in close. "Grandma." His voice sounded a bit hoarse. Grandma's thin, withered hand trembled as she reached out and gently patted the back of his hand. "You've worked hard these days, dear. Grandma knows you're a good child." Grandma's gaze went past him and landed on me, her eyes filled with heartache and guilt. If only this old body hadn't been so useless back then, I wouldn't have held Sylvia back. This child has always carried too much on her mind. She traded her paintings, her future, just to let me live these extra years. Every word from Grandma was like a blunt knife, slowly carving into Hugo's heart. His tall frame gradually hunched over, his head hanging lower and lower, his shoulders beginning to tremble uncontrollably. Grandma, her gaze returned to his face, loving yet perceptive, as if seeing through everything. "I already know about the two of you. You two were fated to meet but not to stay together. The hurdle in her heart, she can't get past it. The guilt in your heart, you can't clear it away either. It's like these tangled threads, they can't be untied. If you pull any harder, they'll just snap. Let her go. And set yourself free as well." Grandma's voice, like the drizzling autumn rain outside the window, gentle yet carrying a bone-chilling coolness, washing away all impractical hopes. Hugo buried his head completely between his knees. I saw a drop of scalding liquid seep from between his fingers, striking the old wooden floor and spreading into a small dark stain. Suppressed, silent sobs filled a small room. Grandmother no longer looks at him and instead gazes out the window. The leaves of the pear tree in the yard have all fallen, leaving only bare branches swaying slightly in the wind and rain. "What a pity," Grandmother sighs softly. "I won't be able to see it bloom next spring." Grandma's funeral was very simple, with only a few close neighbors invited. After Grandma's funeral, I didn't arrange to meet with Hugo again. Instead, I had my lawyer send the final property division agreement and the divorce judgment directly to his office. The day the judgment came down happened to be the first snowfall of early winter. It rarely snowed this heavily in City A, everything was blanketed in white, like covering the past 4 years with a thick layer of white cloth, clean and resolute. Instead of returning to the old courtyard in my hometown, I flew directly to Chengdu with Mo. The studio had long been prepared, and my newly signed comic series, Breaking the Cage, officially launched, reaching the top of the platform's hot search list with its very first chapter. Readers flooded the comments section. "Sis is finally taking flight. Watching Sylvia stomp on that scumbag feels so satisfying. This is truly the pinnacle of female-oriented content." 3 months later, my personal comic exhibition opened at Quanjai Alley in Chengdu. The exhibition was titled "The Sky is High and the Sea is Vast." The venue was packed with people, and the media rushed to report, with headlines that grew increasingly bold. From Hugo's wife to million-follower comic artist. 4 years of endurance, all for this moment of soaring. With her brush, she tore the gilded cage into pieces. At the opening ceremony, I wore a loose sweatshirt I designed myself, with a bird breaking free from vines and soaring into flight printed on the chest. A reporter asked me, "Sylvia, is there a prototype for this exhibition?" I smiled and replied, "Yes, there is. A foolish girl who once locked herself in a cage, now she is free." The live stream was broadcast across the internet in real time, with viewership surpassing 5 million. Some comments in the chat scrolled by. "Is prosecutor Hugo watching?" Feeling a pang of sympathy for Hugo for a second. Wait, no, I can't even spare a second. At that very moment, Hugo was sitting in the empty living room, staring at my smiling face on the TV screen, gripping the remote control so tightly it was almost deformed. The snow fell heavier and heavier, yet the villa felt as cold as an ice cellar. The newly hired nanny was flustered, the dishes were too salty, the soup too bland. After Eleanor smashed 2 vases in anger, she stormed off to a hotel in the city center, refusing to return. Uncle Charles, too old for this, retired early. Before leaving, he sighed and said, "Sir, when the lady was here, this house truly felt like a home." The pudding was left uneaten, and it would just curl up by the old painting desk all day, lazily refusing to move. Hugo tried to pick it up, but it scratched him all over his hands with bloodstains, letting out a sharp cry. The most satisfying part was yet to come. 6 months later, my book Breaking the Cage became a huge success, with the initial print run of 500,000 copies selling out on the first day. At the book signing event, the queue stretched across 3 streets, and fans sent so many flower baskets that they completely blocked the entrance. Someone holds up a sign, "Sylvia is #1 in the world." Ex-husband fans turn neutral, then haters. On the same day, news from City A emerged. Hugo was asked during a press conference for a major case, "Does your private life affect your public image?" He remained silent for a full 10 seconds. The camera zoomed in, clearly revealing the bloodshot eyes and dark circles beneath them. After that press conference, his name topped the trending searches for the first time, not for solving cases swiftly, but because of Hugo's ex-wife's new book cover appears to depict him. Of course, I painted him. On the cover, the man, dressed in a suit and tie, stands with his back to the reader in the center of a splendid yet empty mansion. At his feet lie scattered luxury gift boxes, while above him hangs a shattered birdcage. Its door is wide open, and one bird has already flown into the distance, leaving only a resolute silhouette behind. The comment section exploded. "This is a blatant public execution." The daily series of the prosecutor being utterly crushed by his ex-wife. Haha, Hugo probably doesn't even dare to lift his head when going out now, right? But the real blow was yet to come. A year later, I won an International Comic Award, becoming the first Chinese female author to receive such an honor. The award ceremony was held in Paris. On the red carpet, I wore a stunning black haute couture gown, with a gleaming bird-shaped brooch I designed myself pinned to my shoulder. As the live broadcast camera panned across the audience, it unexpectedly captured a familiar figure, Hugo. He sat in a secluded corner, dressed in a well-fitted suit but noticeably thin, his cheekbones prominent, with dark circles under his eyes. The host asked me for my acceptance speech. Holding the trophy, I smiled and said in French, "Merci à celle que j'ai ilya quatre ans la support tout ca, pour que j'ai puisse voler aujourd'hui." Thank you to the person I was 4 years ago. She endured everything so that I could soar today. The camera zoomed in on Hugo for a close-up. His lips were tightly pressed together, his fingers digging into his knees until the knuckles turned white, yet he never got up to leave. The awards ceremony ended, and I was surrounded by a crowd as I walked out of the venue. The night breeze in Paris, carrying the dampness of the Seine, brushed gently against my cheeks. I looked up at the sky, where a full moon hung over the Eiffel Tower, clear and bright. My phone vibrated once. It was a message from Mo. "Sis, you're trending #1. Sylvia is divine in Paris." Smiling, I turned off my phone and looked up at the boundless night sky. At that moment, I knew. Not only had I flown out of the cage, but I had soared high into the sky where everyone could see me, shining brilliantly, beyond anyone's reach. And the person who had once trapped me in that cage could only gaze up from the ground, looking up for a lifetime.